I think that finding the answer to the origin of COVID would not be as damaging to science and to international relations as failing to find that answer. A more complete understanding of the origins of COVID-19 clearly serves the interest of every person in every nation on this planet. It will limit further recriminations and diminish the likelihood of conflict. It will lead to more effective responses to this pandemic, as well as efforts to anticipate and prevent the next one. Thankfully, it seems more and more scientists are shifting their positions to agree that a laboratory leak hypothesis must be properly investigated at the very least to set a precedent. Despite representing a wide spectrum of opinions on the likelihood of a laboratory leak as the cause of the pandemic, many scientists have united to write open letters calling for a credible and rigorous investigation of both natural and lab-based origin hypotheses. Indeed, the growing calls for an investigation have stimulated renewed conversations around the types of pathogen research being conducted around the world and what scientists can do to make this research safer. How COVID will continue to evolve in terms of deadliness and transmissibility between humans and other animal hosts remains to be seen. But we do know one thing: the virus is here to stay, making any credible knowledge as to its origins all the more critical. Find out more on Emir Phillips' American Pragmatist.
Ignoring all of the remedies, believing all of the rumors, with their endless database. I wanna sit with my enemies and say we should have done this sooner, while I look them in the face. Maybe that will crack the case.
Hello, my name is Levi Mock, graduate of Valparaiso University with a degree in International Relations, International Business, as well as Film and TV Essential Certification out of New York University. You brought me in for a very, I would say, kind of controversial topic, but I'm interested to see what's going on with it. So I just need to know really quick, what kind of drew you to this specific topic?
Well, it was an article. It was a journal article I read in 2020 that came to the stark conclusion that argued that by the time SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, and if I do say in this podcast SARS-CoV-2, I mean COVID-19. That's more the term of virologist, but it was first detected in late 2019, as we know.
Yeah.
But what was odd here, it was already pre-adapted to human transmission to an extent that was similar to late epidemic SARS-CoV 2003, SARS 2003 epidemic. And so we're going to post so the viewers can see the specific article.
Okay.
And the article was, SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 is well adapted for humans. What does that mean for reemergence? And there's the authors. And that was the article that really triggered the podcast.
All right, that sounds pretty interesting, man. I'm into it. So there's a lot to talk about here, but I guess I need to ask, because I'm sure it's very extensive. So what is the gist of this article? What's in a very succinct manner?
Well, I mean, the core thing that provoked me was the fact that COVID-19 was already pre-adapted to human transmission to an extent similar to late epidemic SARS, COVID 2003. And the significance is this: it probably means there was something oddly unique about COVID-19, or that it had been doctored up in a lab with prior mutations already passed and done with.
Would you say this article is reputable?
Dr. Zan was an expert on genomic analysis, and the other two authors were specialists in viral vector engineering at the elite Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. So I'd say this involved a careful, reputable study, peer-reviewed, and since I've read it, it has been cited in the scientific community at least 58 times.
All right, I would say it's nothing to sneeze at, but I mean that kind of begs the thought that if that's true, I mean that COVID-19 was evolving more slowly than what normally occurs when a virus of this type, one that's recently embedded in a human species, coming from an animal source, like a bat or a civet.
SARS in 2003 it went from bat to civet to man, but no matter the implication, it's electrifying since it would mean COVID-19 was already well adapted to human beings from the moment it was first detected in Wuhan in December 2019. And to me, that's more than stunning.
Unlike SARS, in 2003, this virus showed very little, rapid adaptation or evolution in any kind, in the early weeks of the 2019 pandemic, if I recall correctly.
Which clearly implies it was already settled into its final form, and that very strongly implies that the source was almost certainly not via pangolins, aardvarks, anteaters, and probably not the wet markets. So, let's be clear. In the case of SARS-1 in 2003, researchers have already documented the successive changes in its spike protein as the virus evolved step by step into a dangerous pathogen. After it had gotten from bats to civets, there were 6 further changes in its spike protein before it became a mild pathogen in people. Mild. Took 6 changes to get to mild pathogen. After a further 14 changes, the virus was much better adapted to humans. And with a further 4 changes, only then did the epidemic in 2003 take off against humans.
Yeah, and I take it when you look for fingerprints in a similar transition to SARS-2 or COVID-19, a strange surprise, seems to await.
Big time, big time. The virus has changed hardly at all, at least until recently. We had Omicron, and this was admitted, to us by Michael Ryan, the WHO's executive director of health emergencies. Michael Ryan said, and I'll just go straight to his quote because he said it better than me.
Okay.
Michael Ryan said that the patients who died in China tended to be older and that 40% had significant underlying medical conditions, a feature of previous coronavirus outbreaks. He noted that all viruses change, but that this one is showing stability. Quote, "We're not seeing huge changes in the viral genomic sequence," he said. So the source here is a travel ban goes into effect in Chinese city of Wuhan as authorities try to stop coronavirus spread. And that's January 22nd, 2020, and that's from the WHO.
Wait, so from COVID-19's first appearance, it was well adapted to human cells already. And apparently this was admitted by Michael Ryan, a top official in the World Health Organization. Yes. So that's all true.
January 22nd, 2020. I mean, that's pretty early on, Levi. It was November, December 2019. So within weeks of it going, global. So absolutely, the answer absolutely yes. Furthermore, researchers led by Alina Chan of the Broad Institute, which I referred to earlier, compared COVID-19 with late-stage SARS-1, which by then was well adapted to human cells, and found that the 2 viruses were similarly well adapted. I'm now going to quote from the Zahn article, Dr. Zahn's article we alluded to earlier. By the time SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, was first detected in late 2019, it was already pre-adapted to human transition to an extent similar to late epidemic SARS-CoV, which is SARS 2003.
What does this mean in, I guess, in a practical sense, in terms of speaking terms for the origin of COVID-19?
Even those who think that lab origin is unlikely agree that COVID-19 genomes are remarkably uniform. And scientifically, this means, and here I'll quote from an article by Dr. Barak, who concluded, and I quote, "Early strains identified in Wuhan, China showed limited genetic diversity, which suggests that the virus may have been introduced from a single source." And that's Dr. Barak 2020, and the emergence of a highly fit COVID variant, not variant 2, COVID-19. And I want the viewers to be aware here, it's from the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a top peer-reviewed, arguably the best medicine of a journal peer-reviewed in medicine in the world. So it's a very serious article.
Scientifically speaking, the pragmatic implication here is that COVID-19 was much more likely brought to the market by a person and not an animal.
Correct. A single source would of course be compatible with lab escape, less so with the massive variation and selection, which is evolution's hallmark way of doing business. The uniform structure of COVID-19 genomes gives no hint of any passage through an intermediate animal host. No such animal host has been identified in nature as yet, period.
So we don't know where it came from. Does that imply that the source is still out there?
Well, Levi, that's why we did the podcast. That's the whole point of the podcast. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah. Okay, I got you. All right. So then,
in the words of the paper's title, a virus could have become well adapted for humans by having spent time in human cells, or is there like a different way?
Another way is in a so-called humanized animal in a laboratory.
Okay.
Humanized animals, usually mice, have had their genomes altered in a laboratory to include a key human gene. In this case, the entry receptor for certain SARS-related coronaviruses.
One second. Like, all right, I think I did get ahead of myself. Like, were there any other prompts that might have triggered this podcast other than what was stated before?
Yes. After COVID-19 hit, later on, there was low-key announcements from the Chinese authorities that no animals in the Hunan seafood market in Wuhan, China, had tested positive for COVID-19.
What is so startling about that?
Well, I mean, it shows this is consistent with the findings of the research articles I've been citing in this podcast. I just cited it, throughout it so far, and it concluded that the market samples are genetically identical to human SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 isolates, and were therefore most likely from human sources.
So then at this point, you no longer believe the communist Chinese government version of this COVID-19 story, that it came from animals sold in the Huana, which is how you pronounce it, the Huana seafood market in Wuhan, specifically bats.
Yeah, correct. I mean, bats, wildlife markets, possibly pangolins, aardvarks, possibly laboratories may all have played some role. But the simple story, the simplistic story of an animal in a market infected by a bat that then infected several human beings is just not credible. And the communist Chinese government has immorally perpetuated this false narrative to this very day, obfuscating the truth at a global level. It's ridiculous.
Why would the Chinese government, or any government for that matter, why would a government do this?
After the pandemic first broke out in December 2019, Chinese authorities reported that many cases had occurred in the wet market, a place selling wild animals for meat in Wuhan.
Okay.
Critically, this reminded experts around the globe, it would have automatically triggered a reminder around the globe of virology experts of the SARS-1 epidemic of 2002-2003, in which a bat virus spread from bats to civets, and animals sold in wet markets, because the Chinese do eat civets, a feline animal, and it went from civets to people. A similar bat virus caused a second epidemic known as MERS in 2012. This time, the intermediary hosts were camels. So the Chinese government intended to throw this chum in the water, knowing that the recent experience with SARS 2003, with the civets, 2012 with the camels, would veer globally virology experts around the globe down a plethora of rabbit holes leading nowhere.
Was there any legitimate basis for any of this?
Well, I mean, the decoding of COVID-19's genome showed that it belonged to a viral family known as beta coronaviruses, to which SARS-1 and MERS viruses also belong. The relationship would at first glance support the idea that, like them, it was a natural virus that had managed to jump from bats via another animal host, civets and camels, 2003, 2012, to people. But to be crystal clear, the wet market connection, the only other point of similarity with SARS-1 and MERS epidemics, was soon broken. Chinese researchers found earlier cases of COVID-19 in Wuhan with no link whatsoever to the wet market. Other people not connected to the wet market at all got COVID-19 before the people they said at the wet market got COVID-19. But that seemed not to matter when so much further evidence in support of a natural emergence was expected any day now, expected shortly.
Wait, so that happened. This actually happened. I mean, since then, has any evidence turned up of a chain of COVID-19 infections of animal to human in a market, a village, or anything like that? A town somewhere?
No, Levi, not at all. Not one, zero, zilch, nada.
Okay, all right. Let's take a step back here. So currently, as it stands today, why should we as a society, why should we care about the origin of this disease, about COVID-19?
For starters, how the COVID-19 epidemic started, I think, is the keenest mystery of our lifetime. It's clear it led to the deaths of millions of people, sickened hundreds of millions, and dramatically changed the lives of almost all of us on planet Earth. But at the end of the day, if you don't find out how this epidemic began, you're going to be ill-equipped next time to know when, where, and how the next epidemic may start. So in that sense, I think it's absolutely critical we find out the origins of COVID.
I would just say, like public and media perceptions, were shaped in favor of the natural, emergent scenario, by it seemed the entire global scientific community.
Critically, a group of virologists worldwide, as you said, the global scientific community, and others wrote in The Lancet, a journal, on February 19, 2020, when it was really far too soon for anyone to be sure what had happened. And we're going to throw up on the screen here what they said. And it was statement in support of the scientists, public health professionals, and medical professionals of China combating COVID-19. And one of the authors there, the readers really need to focus on there, is Peter Daszak. Peter Daszak works with EcoHealth Alliance, and he's going to become absolutely critical in this story. And look at the date, February 19, 2020. So this is early on, and it substantiates what you just alluded to.
What exactly is the Lancet? I mean, I know it's a journal, but like, could you be like a little more specific? This is not my world too much.
Yeah. The Lancet is a weekly peer-reviewed general medical journal and one of the oldest of its kind. It's also the world's highest impact academic journal, meaning it's one of the most cited journals by its fellow colleagues, virologists and doctors around the world, and it was founded in England in 1823. So it's as highly respected as a medical journal, scientific journal, as you would find on planet Earth.
What are these esteemed scientists? What do they assert in the Lancet?
We're just going to quote it. We're going to throw up the quote, so we don't need to speculate. We have the article, so let's quote it. We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. Scientists overwhelmingly conclude, don't hypothesize, they conclude that this virus originated in wildlife. It was a stirring rallying call for readers to stand with their Chinese colleagues on the front line of fighting COVID-19. And look at the words they used this early on in the fight against COVID. Overwhelmingly conclude. I mean, I'll be frank, that's just plain asinine, unscientific, stupid, and politicizing something for which they had no basis. And every author on that article should be shamed.
Yeah, and it sounds like you seem to find this rallying cry, a little premature.
First off, contrary to the letter's writer's assertion, the idea that the virus might have escaped from a lab invoked accident, not conspiracy. This theory surely needed to be explored, not rejected out of hand and mocked. A defining mark of good scientists is that they go to great pains to distinguish what they know and, more importantly, admit what they don't know, being objective. By this scientific criterion, by this objective criteria, the signatories of the Lancet letter were behaving as poor scientists. They were assuring the public of facts they could not know for sure were true, and yet they said overwhelmingly confident. Just horrific.
You said a lot of interesting things there, Emir, but the first thing you said, the very first thing was you said, first off, which alludes that there's another reason you kind of have against this Lancet article.
True, and it's more ominous. I should have said that the first time, but while we're here, I'll get to it.
Yeah.
And I already talked about this person, and I'm going to be frank, Peter Daszak. He's a doozy, and I'm being kind when I say that. It later turned out that the Lancet letter had been organized and drafted by Peter Daszak, president of the EcoHealth Alliance of New York. Dr. Daszak's organization funded coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. If the COVID-19 had indeed escaped from the research he funded, Dr. Daszak would be potentially culpable. This hyper-acute conflict of interest was not declared to the Lancet's readers, scientists, and esteemed virologists around the world. To the contrary, the letter concluded, and I quote, and I put it up for people to see, "We declare no competing interests." It was a bald-faced lie. It was nothing short of a pack of lies. It trotted around as a scientific conclusion, overwhelmingly conclusive. This is just insanity. So Peter Daszak is a notorious figure in this story, notorious.
If you had to surmise, like what was the motive here? I mean, you've kind of baited it a bit, like what's the motive here?
The virologists like Dr. Daszak, they got a lot of stake in assigning the blame for the pandemic. For 20 years, mostly beneath the public's attention, they've been playing a dangerous game in gain of function research going on globally that people aren't really aware of. In their laboratories, they routinely create viruses more dangerous than those that exist in nature. They argue they do so safely and that by getting ahead of nature, they can predict and prevent natural spillovers, the crossover of viruses from an animal host to people. So they create or allow mutation. Hopefully they come up with a vaccine. And then if the virus mutates that way, they've got the vaccine. Of course, the pharmaceutical that paid for that mutation has the vaccine and makes a buttload, a ton of, an incredible amount of money. So if COVID-19 had indeed escaped from such a laboratory experiment called gain of function research, which is going on globally and people don't know about it, a savage blowback from the entire planet could be expected against virologists globally not safeguarding gain of function research sufficiently. And the storm of public indignation would affect virologists everywhere, not in China. The MIT technology review editor, Antonio Regalado, said it best in March 2020, and I quote, "If this happened and people found out that the gain of research had gotten out of control and people knew around the world that viruses were allowed to be mutated specifically for humans, anticipating a mutation and creating a vaccine for it, and it got out of hand and slipped out of the lab," quote, "it would shatter the scientific evidence from top to bottom." So there's your motive for the hush hush.
It's just a bit surreal. I mean, I never thought things, would get this far. I mean, when news broke in 2019 that, a pneumonia of unknown cause was sending people to hospitals in Wuhan, I remember the footage, I remember the stories. I just figured, the strongest bet was that, it would soon be, brought under control, just as SARS was, in the past, and it had been 17 years before. So it just seemed likely that was going to be the case.
Frankly, me too. After all, it'd been more than a century since a respiratory virus had caused a global pandemic on that scale.
Yeah, I just remember the initial reports, back in January when it first hit, they were confident that this novel coronavirus was being, caught directly from animals. That was said over and over again.
And like many such zoonoses, at first would therefore not be so easily transmitted from person to person. So any pandemic was extremely unlikely.
Before we go any further, what is zoonosis? What was that?
Zoonosis is another name for a zoonotic disease, which is a disease that passes from an animal or insect to a human. Okay. It jumps from animals to us, mankind.
Not only were we, told by the Chinese that it jumped, as you mentioned before, at the point of origin was the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan, but it was spreading rapidly, which is odd, it being so incredibly contagious.
Yeah. By January 20th, the Chinese government was compelled to notify the world that the virus could indeed transmit between humans.
He had no choice in the matter. Videos of overwhelmed hospitals, as I mentioned already, when the Wuhan, began to leak online, and that was just like the story that just kept getting, pushed out in front of us.
Yeah. They didn't have any choice. There was no kindness on their part. But over the next few months, we learned just how and why COVID-19 was so contagious. Scientists learned that people who just caught COVID-19 and were completely pre-symptomatic individuals could easily infect other people, which is one reason why the mask would not work. One significant reason, they weren't N95 to begin with. But beyond that, by the time you got a symptom of COVID-19, you'd done a lot of your spreading to other people. In other words, you were highly infectious before you had any symptoms at all, which is one reason the masks were not working beyond others. So worse still, COVID-19 could spread via the air. Yet again, another reason making most masks largely useless.
I mean, I'm just kind of piecing this all in my head. Like I keep thinking back to, there's so much information coming at me so fast, but it seems kind of like COVID was geared to spread.
These characteristics are absolutely not typical of a zoonotic disease, one that went straight from animal to man. Today, research and public health experts have described COVID-19 as one of the trickiest pathogens to combat because of these unique characteristics that dramatically reduce the efficacy of standard public health interventions. So
and being so unique, it would seem that the origin of this unique disease, COVID-19, it kind of matters.
I mean, hence, that was the other prompt for this podcast. So
Yeah.
that rounds out all my motives.
Yeah. So then to clarify really quick. So if some animal population is definitely out there, carrying this virus, exquisitely adept at infecting people, I mean, I feel like it must be found before it can trigger another pandemic. I mean, I feel like that should be priority one.
Yeah. And if, God forbid, some human practice actually encourages spread, like the farming of wildlife for food, or the disturbance of some natural habitat, or eating civets, this, you got to stop the practice. Or if some research experiment or fieldwork project had gone awry, lessons must be learned and laboratory practices reviewed globally. If the practice is global, like gain of function research, searching for the origin of COVID-19 cannot, be some idle pastime for a few curious scientists and internet sleuths. It's really a vital task for the safety of humankind. It really demands a vigorous, credible and evidence-based investigation by experts worldwide. We all got to come together on this.
The issue of an animal being the source of COVID-19 seems to have been resolved since the last 2 years. Tens of thousands of animals, both wild and domesticated. All those animals, they've reportedly been, sampled across China, as far as I know. And not a single animal of any kind has tested positive for COVID-19 so far, unless I'm mistaken.
You're not mistaken. That's absolutely correct. And so I think that leads to the next issue. And a key to this mystery, for me at least, is answering this critical question. Why in Wuhan, of all places? Is that, out of all the cities in the world, how did Wuhan become the original epicenter of a SARS pandemic? Why? Why there? I think at least you got to investigate that question. You have to.
I guess I didn't really consider that. So what does make, Wuhan such a unique city? And I imagine you have something and somewhat of an answer for that.
Well, I think the answer to that question came from an anonymous Twitter user called The Seeker, a former science teacher in India who unearthed a medical thesis in May 2020. And this thesis carefully chronicles the story of miners in the Yunnan province in southern China, near Indochina, who'd been sickened with a mysterious pneumonia after working in a bat-infested copper mine in 2012.
That was in 2012. What follow-up was there?
Researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, led by China's leading expert on bat viruses, Dr. Shi Zhengli, also known as the Bat Lady, mounted frequent expeditions to the bat-infested caves in Yunnan in southern China and collected around 100 different bat coronaviruses. Specifically, in 2013, the Wuhan Institute of Virology team did collect a virus that would later prove the closest genetic match to COVID-19 that we currently have.
Did this lead to any additional research, after all this happened?
Oh yeah, it did. And we're going to put up the article here for the viewers to see. So here's the article. The title is "A SARS-like cluster of circulating bat coronaviruses shows potential for human emergence." And there are your authors there. I want the viewers to see Zhengli Shi, and right next to Zhengli Shi is Ralph S. Barrett from North Carolina, American. Yeah. His name's already been mentioned. His name will be mentioned again. So please, viewers, make the connection with the Bat Lady, Zhengli Shi, and Ralph S. Barrett from North Carolina. There they are, in 2015, working together. The names will coincide again. Look at how many people accessed this journal article. 2.74 million people, 497 citations by other virologists. So as this article reveals, Dr. Shi, the Bat Lady, teamed up with Ralph S. Barrett, who is an eminent coronavirus researcher at the University of North Carolina. Their work focused on enhancing the ability of bat viruses to attack humans so as to, and I quote, examine the emergence potential, that is potential to infect humans, of circulating bat COVS, coronaviruses. In pursuit of this aim, in November 2015, they created a novel virus by taking the backbone of the SARS-1 virus, 2003, and replacing its spike protein with one from a bat virus. This manufactured virus was able to infect the cells of the human airway, at least when tested against the lab culture of such cells.
If that virus escaped, could you predict its trajectory, like where it would be going?
No, you could not. No.
No? Okay.
No more than you could predict evolution. No.
So didn't these virologists, understand like the risks? This is pretty risky, like pretty dangerous.
First off, what they did, known as a chimera, that's what it's called, a chimera, because its genome contains genetic material from 2 strains of virus. Secondly, Dr. Barak and Dr. Shi referred to the obvious risk in the article. They did refer to it, but argued they should be weighed against the benefit of foreshadowing future spillovers, future mutations. Scientific review panels, they wrote, quote, may deem similar studies building chimeric viruses based on circulating strains too risky to pursue. So they acknowledge, this could go too far. Given various restrictions being placed on gain of function research, which you've already alluded to, matters had arrived in their view at, quote, a crossroads of gain of function research concerns. The potential to prepare for and mitigate future outbreaks must be weighed against the risk of creating more dangerous pathogens. In developing policies moving forward, it is important to consider the value of the data generated by these studies and whether these types of chimeric virus studies warrant further investigation versus the inherent risks involved, end quote.
I mean, from the hindsight of 2021, one could say that the value of gain of function studies in preventing the COVID-19 epidemic, I would say it's like 0. But like the risk was catastrophic if needed, the COVID-19 virus was generated in a gain of function experiment, but it seems like I got sidetracked. I want to come back to the copper mine in 2012, in the Yunnan province, I think you said where it was at. What was the research in that? Like what came out of that whole endeavor, unearthing that stuff?
Nothing, 0, nothing.
What do you mean nothing?
Nothing, man. The communist Chinese government will not let anyone near it. Why you've never heard about it. And the WHO hasn't really pushed hard to get there, and neither has any Western European government or the U.S. government. No government has tried to get to that copper mine where it all started, and we can only fathom why.
So wait, how do we know about this then? Like, how do we find out about this copper mine at all?
We know the story of the Mijiangong copper miners only because of the medical thesis written by Li Zhu Lei Shu, and if I'm butchering the name, I apologize, a student at Kunming Medical University, completed in May 2013, entitled, and we're going to show our viewers this, The Analysis of Sick Patients with Severe Pneumonia Caused by Unknown Viruses. The thesis concluded that the 6 miners had been infected by a SARS-related coronavirus from bats. And the author noted that it was essential to investigate the bats in the copper mine.
That sounds pretty significant. Like, why this obstruction for the access of the mine, by China? What's the motive? Like, what could you possibly gain from this?
I would argue the motive is that at this point today, that obstruction amounts to communist China being an accessory to murder after the fact. Whether the communist Chinese government was involved in COVID-19 to any extent earlier than when it was discovered, it is absolutely clear that this is obstruction of justice, making them accessory to murder by not allowing a complete and thorough investigation by concerned scientists, of which there apparently none seem to be organized at any organizational level, at an international level, to actually go to China and get to the bottom of this. I don't know of anyone that's pressured the government, and then the government certainly hasn't facilitated. So, perhaps, let's give the communist Chinese government the benefit of the doubt, perhaps there was no criminal intent before COVID-19 hit, but now today, come on. It's been years and they're still obstructing all efforts to find the truth. They're on the hook, at least for after the fact, at least.
So in the long run, then, I would hope the truth, will win out. China is only kind of making this making this whole matter like worse for themselves. Instead, they seem so hell-bent on trying to convince the world that, just keep their heads in the sand and convince us all, just go forward, like for a better tomorrow, off there, no worries here, nothing to see here.
Well,
it kind of feels like that. It really does.
This podcast is taking its head out of the sand. Point is, in the spring of 2012, 6 men were admitted to a hospital in Kunming, the capital of Yunnan province in southwest China. Their symptoms were dry cough, shortness of breath, high fevers, aching muscles, headaches, and fatigue. All 6 miners had worked in the same mine in Mojang County, clearing guano up to 150 meters deep in the bat-infested cave. So 150 meters deep of bat poo. 4 of the miners died. The 4 oldest miners died when they failed to respond to a barrage of antibiotics and antifungals.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Emir, these symptoms sounds a little similar, to SARS back in 2003.
Absolutely, which is why these miners potentially infected by a SARS-related coronavirus in a bat-infested mine did not go unnoticed by prominent laboratories in China. I mean, China was not stupid to this.
Wait, so, did China respond institutionally specifically? Did they institutionally respond to these?
They did. They jumped on it. They were nervous about SARS 2003 making a comeback. So it drew in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the Chengdu Military Center for Disease Control, which, by the way, is also in Wuhan, China. Surprise, surprise. The Beijing Institute of Pathogen Biology, and even the laboratory of Dr. George Fu Gao, the deputy director of China's National Center for Disease Control and Prevention. The CDC is a network of regional public health laboratories throughout China with headquarters in Beijing. And it's important to remember that Dr. Gao was promoted to director in 2017, 5 years after learning and dealing with what happened to these infected miners, copper miners, in 2012 in the Mojang County, and that copper mine in 2012.
Wait, so to be clear, this incident in the copper mine in 2012, it drew in everybody, in China who was an expert on viruses. Correct?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
And Wuhan, to be clear, Wuhan is the virology expert city of China. So, but yeah, pretty much.
Right.
So, keep in mind these facts. We don't know how many men worked in the Mojang mine that April and May in 2012, but 6 were admitted to a hospital. Critical to note, they weren't admitted to a hospital, not to the nearby hospital in Pu'er City, less than a 2-hour drive away, nor were they admitted to a hospital in Yoshi, less than a 4-hour drive away. Rather, these infected miners were admitted to the hospital in the provincial capital of Kunming, almost a 6-hour drive to the north. These 6 men had been administratively referred there by their local hospital and clinics for specialized treatment at the Kunming Medical University Hospital. Soon thereafter, all the experts in virology in China had something, they knew something was wrong.
Yeah.
And this was known at an institutional level, especially in Wuhan. So China is known to having known institutionally in 2012, and that specifically includes the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There's no arguing about this.
Okay. By the reaction by the hospital administration, it's clear to, at least to me, that something was a little bit of a miss. But other than the reemergence of SARS, was there anything here particularly unusual?
The Wuhan Institute of Virology mounted at least 4 different expeditions to the mine, and at least 3 more in the subsequent 2 years. So in my mind, something other than your typical SARS was going on, and the Wuhan Institute of Virology, by their actions, indicate they were extremely concerned, and they thought something unusual was going on. The reaction by the Wuhan Institute of Virology is that they had encountered something utterly new. SARS, not from a civet like last time, but now it was from a bat in a copper mine in Yunnan near Indochina that had infected men directly with no intermediary hosts, no snake, no wet animal sold in a wet market, no civet, no animal intermediary host at all, direct from bat to man in 2012. That would have been startling, unbelievably unique to the Wuhan Institute of Virology in 2012.
So I guess the reaction by the Wuhan sorry, I want to make sure I say it correctly, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. God, it's a long name. All right, but it was so strong that if you are right, Emir, if you're right, the Chinese are trying to have the first ever recorded case catching a SARS-like virus directly from a bat.
Yeah, exactly. Remember, it was the Wuhan Institute of Virology that had successfully tracked down a reservoir of SARS-like viruses, very similar to the one that had caused the 2002-2003 outbreak. In a horseshoe bat of the species Rhinolophus sinicus, the type of bat, in a natural cave also in Yunnan province.
So what was the practical results of these efforts then, by the, I wish I had an acronym for it, but the Wuhan Institute of Virology, in terms of the scientific community, like what came of that?
After sampling hundreds of bats from the Muzhang copper mine, Dr. Shi's team discovered a single novel SARS-like coronavirus, SL-CoV, in 2013. They published a tiny part of its genomic sequence. Why only a tiny part is another mystery, but a tiny part of its genomic sequence in 2016 under the name BTCOV, bat coronavirus /4991, and that's going to become very important in this story. It was found in a subtly different species of horseshoe bat from the one that by then was known to to harbor the progenitors of SARS. But this bat, unlike the bat in SARS that did the SARS 2002-2003 epidemic, this bat in the copper mine was the Rhinolophus affinis, the intermediate horseshoe bat, as opposed to the Chinese horseshoe bat Rhinolophus sinicus, which is the SARS one in 2003.
The bat related to SARS 2003 breakout, right?
Yeah. Then years later, in November 2020, Dr. Shi, the bat lady, revealed that at least another 8 SARS-like coronaviruses had been discovered in the Muzhang mine by her team in 2015.
That's kind of astounding to me. I mean, it's pretty incriminating for a leader of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, to not publicize their findings for what was like 5 years, 5, 4, 5. Yeah.
I mean, especially when COVID-19 had apparently originated a few city blocks from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It comes out a few city blocks away, and now you're telling this something you discovered 5 years ago. There's just too many coincidences here. The bat lady's full of bat guano. This is ridiculous.
I mean, if this finding, if appropriately published, I think it would have set like the scientific community, in virology, on fire, around the world.
It should have, but the lack of fanfare regarding these new SARS-CoV viruses or new strands of coronaviruses is extremely puzzling. Keeping in mind the mysterious SARS-like illness that had afflicted the workers in the mine, which we referred to earlier, the BT COVID /4991 sample should have been of immense scientific interest, meaning it should have been, and normally is, published immediately with full disclosure and transparency.
Yeah, so here was like a SARS-like virus from a horseshoe bat found at the site where 4 people had died from SARS-like disease.
Yeah, the oldest.
I mean, yeah, it was exactly what the expeditions to the mine have been seeking, so why not just be fully open to the scientific community about that? These results that they found here, why not just do that?
I don't know, but Dr. Shi's 2016 paper made no mention of the miner's death. It was left to readers to connect the dots by connecting this article, to the Muzhang miners.
All right, so to be clear, okay, when and where did the Chinese officially first encounter COVID-19? I guess undocumented.
Officially in the city of Wuhan in central China in December 2019, when the Wuhan Center for Disease Control and Prevention detected a novel coronavirus in patients with atypical pneumonia, November 2019. Officially.
All right, real quick, just walk me through that. Walk me through those events right there. Let's go for that.
One of the first teams to obtain a sequence of the genome of the virus causing the disease was led by Dr. Liu Yingle from Wuhan University State Key Laboratory of Virology. As I said, there are a lot of virology centers in Wuhan. This is like the capital of virology research for China.
Okay.
On January 2nd, 2020, they took samples from 2 unusual pneumonia patients in the Zhongnan Hospital at Wuhan University.
Okay.
A 39-year-old man who had worked at the Hunan seafood market in Wuhan and had fallen ill on December 20th, 2019, and a 21-year-old woman who had had contact with the Hunan seafood market staff on December 22nd.
Okay.
By January 7th, the scientists had sequenced the virus genome, something that would have been an extraordinary achievement 20 years earlier, but now is fast and routine, thank God. And on January 8th, they looked in databases for a match and noticed that a section of the genome of the virus they had isolated shared a 98.7% identity with BTCOV/4991, which comes from the copper mine in 2012. Remember, that is the published fragment of the genome of the virus found in the Mojang copper mine in 2012 or 2013 officially by the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
I mean, was any of this published in a reputable scientific journal somewhere? Like that, like on January 8th, Chinese virologists had noticed that a section of COVID-19 genome, shared like damn near 99% identity with a genome from bats in that copper mine, back in the Yunnan province, way back in 2012. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, Dr. Leo's Yingle's paper was published in a prominent journal, Emerging Microbes and Infections, prominent journal on February 5th, 2020.
Yeah,
so
a lot of authors.
RNA-based NGS approach identifies a novel human coronavirus from 2 individual pneumonia cases in 2019 Wuhan outbreak. And you see some of the authors we've talked about already in this journal. So, and it was published, as I said, February 5th, 2020. Article views, look at the article views, 32,000, almost 33,000, experts, virology experts viewed it, read it. I mean, that's a lot of people for experts.
This should have been big news, Amir. I guess this is relevant news. I mean, nearly 99% match for a genome fragment. It's strikingly high. And it should have, at the very least, raised a few eyebrows, implying, the possible connection to the COVID-19 pandemic. It's just kind of surreal,
Well, there's a reason here, instead, you're right. It got little attention because, and here's why, Levi, because 2 days earlier on February 3rd, a paper conveniently cut in front of and had been published in the prestigious journal Nature by Dr. Shi, the bat lady, Dr. Shi's team from the Wuhan Institute of Virology just across town.
Wait, so Dr. Shi and Dr. Yingo, they both work in Wuhan.
Oh yeah. Dr. Shi was in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and Dr. Yingle works in Wuhan University State Key Laboratory of Virology.
That's a bit of a coincidence, I would say.
I mean, look, keep in mind, remember, we've said many times now in this podcast, Wuhan is the virology center of all of China. The CD regional center is also there, and academically, it's not crazy. It's no coincidence. They all cross-pollinate. We do it too. Look at Silicon Valley. We cross-pollinate on, AI over there. Yeah. So keep in mind that the CDC in Wuhan is affiliated, though, with the People's Liberation Army of China. The CDC in Wuhan is a more clear connection to the Liberation Army of China, is less independent than the Wuhan Institute of Virology, at least facially, institutionally. And so the viewers need to keep in mind that the CDC in Wuhan is intimately connected with the People's Liberation Army of China.
Okay.
It brings up the specter of bioweaponization right across the street, not too far away from the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Yeah. Okay. So, I guess going back to Dr. Shi's article, then that cut in front of Dr. Yingle's article. Go back to that real quick. So,
all right. In that paper, Dr. Shi and her colleagues had also reported assembling a full genome sequence of the new virus. They found a 79.6% match between the new virus and the 2002-2003 SARS epidemic virus. Only after noting this did they mention a match between part of the COVID-19 virus and a short region of the genome of another bat virus called RAT-G13, rat G13. This fragment, they said, had been derived from a virus sample collected from a Rhinolopholis affinis bat from Yunnan province. And to be clear, that's from the copper miners in 2012, which was conveniently left out. Dr. Shi, the bat lady, carried out full-length sequencing on this sample and found an overall 96.2% genome match with COVID-19. So a 96.2 genome match to COVID-19 from the copper mine in 2012.
All right, so 96% match between COVID-19 and the virus from the copper mine in Mohon County, correct?
Yeah, it's correct.
All right, so if I'm being so bold, I mean, this seems like a misdirection on the part of the Chinese government. That's what it seems like. I'm just calling a spade a spade. I'm just calling what I see here. So coincidentally, it seems that Dr. Shi knew Dr. Yingle's paper was coming out and misdirected, the world over to a lower match by finding a 79.4, 79.7, whatever it was, percent match between the new virus and the 2003 SARS epidemic virus. I mean, that's kind of like Dr. Shi was trying to say COVID-19, it came from SARS, which came from an animal. In that case, give me some, I'm just trying to piece it all together. It's like, in that case, the civet, then as we mentioned before. When in fact, the better match would have been the virus in the copper mines, which did originate from a bat and not from a civet.
Yeah. And the misdirection worked, man. It worked. This alleged discovery caused headlines around the world. That caused headlines, the misdirection, not the truth. That's convenient. It was the first evidence a COVID-19 epidemic had been caused by a new coronavirus of a probable bat origin, as the title of Dr. Shi's paper put it. At the time, there was speculation about COVID-19 having come from snakes, bamboo rats, or some other kind of creature sold in the Hunan Wet Sea market. Speculation, I might add, fully encouraged by the Chinese authorities' announcement on January 22nd that the virus probably came from wild animals sold at the market. All government communist propaganda that they knew was propaganda when they spewed the crapola out, the bat guano out into the world. And we have proof of this. There's no debating this at all anymore. We're going to throw up an article. Here it comes. There's no debating this. Travel ban goes into effect in Chinese city of Wuhan as authorities try to stop coronavirus spread. January 22nd, 2020. Chinese health officials said that they had ascertained that the virus started in an unsanitary food market that was selling wild and exotic animals for consumptions. Snakes were the most likely cause of the virus, coronavirus. 5 Chinese scientists concluded in a scientific article, a paper published Wednesday in the Journal of Medical Virology. Medical virology, they said it was snakes. Now you're laughing now, but nobody was laughing then when the Chinese Communist government was spewing out this propaganda. Here's the article. You're looking at it. You can look it up on Google Scholar. All you got to do is get on that internet. Cross-species transmission of the newly identified coronavirus. And there's published. That's January 22nd. How did something get published that fast? The Chinese government only admitted to it publicly on January 7th, January 8th. 2 weeks later, it's published in the Journal of Virology, a top journal. All authors contributed equally to this work. Of course, the main author, in my opinion, is probably the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, specifically, this article included in its abstract. Let's just read it. Our findings suggest that COVID-19 has most similar genetic information with bat coronavirus and most similar codon usage bias with snake. Taken together, our results suggest that homologous recombination may occur and contribute to the 2019 corona cross-species transmission. I mean, it just blows my mind.
All right. This is so much. All right. Any other misdirections here by the Chinese authorities? Is there more than just already this more that you've already slapped them down from?
Yes, there's more. There's more. It's a full-time job to do this garbage. The sentence in the journal announcing the discovery of RAT-G13 had no citation. I teach economics at University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, and I've had published
Yeah.
articles and peer-reviewed articles, about 15 now. And you have to cite, you have citations. If you miss a
Yeah.
citation, the editors are real good about spotting it.
Yeah.
This is a very important announcement. This is a world-shattering article. And the key part of the article, the RATG13 genome sequence, had no citation. So what does that mean? It means there was no reference to determine where this partial genome RATG13 had come from, which of course was the copper mine in 2012. And that, to me, I just can't think that's coincidental. I don't know how the editors missed that. That's a whole mystery right there. Somebody needs to contact the journal editors and go, hey, man, how could you not miss a cite for this big an article on this? I mean, I don't know. It's highly suspicious.
Yeah, in a scientific journal, that seems intentional. But nevertheless, looking past that for a second, we know now that this partial genome, RATG13, however you want to say it, it came from a copper mine in 2012 from the Muzhang mine. Yeah, it came from there.
And the emission, Levi, whether intentional or not, made it even more impossible to connect the dots from COVID-19, the Muzhang copper mine in Yunnan province in 2012. And that's the real crime here. And the coincidences, my friend, keep piling up here to where you can only think intentionality, at least after the fact, by the Chinese government and a lot of scientists working in cahoots with them. That's my opinion so far. I mean, and I think the evidence is leading that way.
All right. So to try to summarize, a lot's been said, so like, an outbreak of mysterious, pneumonia in a copper mine, more than 1,800 kilometers rather, I would say, by road from Wuhan, led to patient samples being sent to Wuhan for analysis. Okay, that's one thing I say. And then in 2013, the medical thesis, concluded after incorporating results shared by the Wuhan Institute of Virology that these miners had likely been infected by SARS-like coronavirus from bats in the mine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And then an expedition by the Wuhan virologists to seek the viral cause brought back hundreds of samples from bats. Their repeated visits to the copper mine turned up a bat-borne coronavirus in 2013, which was recognized to be a novel SARS-like coronavirus, novel from a different bat, which we've already alluded to. The Wuhan Institute of Virology team partly sequenced this new virus in 2017 and then fully sequenced it in 2018. We're getting close here. When its sequence was found to closely match the sequence of the virus causing COVID-19. The Wuhan scientists published it under a new name and failed to cite their own paper detailing its discovery or to reveal that they had been studying the virus over the past few years, or to mention that it had come from a copper mine where there had been a fatal outbreak of pneumonia where the oldest 4 out of 6 victims who caught the virus died when the virus didn't work well to antifungals and antibiotics.
Jeez. All right. It's just a lot for my brain to wrap around, right there. But okay then. Okay. So going forward then, it's like, was there any response from the scientific community to Dr. Shi's, February paper from way back when?
Eventually, on November 17th, 2020, Nature published an addendum to Dr. Shi, the Bat Lady's February paper. Okay. The addendum acknowledged the existence of the Komen medical thesis, finally, and it confirmed the story about the Muzhang copper mine and the testing of the miners' samples at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And the new name assigned to the sequence from the 4991 sample and the sequencing of its full genome by 2018 rather than 2020. We have it up on screen, and I quote, addendum, a pneumonia outbreak associated with the new coronavirus of probable bat origin. So, a little late in the game, but better late than never, I guess.
Yeah, so small, just a little footnote, added in. All right, so I guess, so while the journal Nature, the journal Nature, name Nature, addendum, it's great, it's fine, it's awesome, whatever. My timeline tells me that it had taken, 9 months for the for the Wuhan Institute of Virology, those scientists there, they come clean about the scintillating history of the RATG13. So many names and numbers here. But anyways, the RATG13, the partial genome of what is, in all probability, COVID-19. That's from the Mu Zhang copper mine 2012.
And during that interim, Levi, Dr. Segreto, Dr. Rahalkar, the Seeker, and other unnamed internet sleuths had been correct about these points for quite some time now, to their credit. They had been dismissed as conspiracy right-wing theorists at the time and derided by prominent virologists, and that's why they remained unnamed. They were scared, although they did speak through Twitter, so to their credit.
Yeah, and I remember we were talking a little bit about this before the podcast, but you said the addendum revealed two further, startling, pieces of information. So what were those?
Yeah, you're right. Not only were the samples from the 4 sick miners tested at the time of the viruses, but they were retested after COVID-19 pandemic began. In other words, the samples from the patients had been stored at the Wuhan Institute of Virology throughout the intervening period. Yet these hypercritical samples had not been shared with independent research groups outside of China for verification.
I mean, that had to be willful, I'd imagine.
Come on. I would think so. And I'm being polite. And the second revelation from when we talked over breakfast from the addendum was that far from turning up just one SARS-like bat-borne virus in their expeditions to the Muzhang mine, the Wuhan Institute of Virology team had in fact found at least 9. And I now quote from the journal's Nature's addendum, the addendum they did, I quote,
yeah.
Between 2012 and 2015, our group sampled bats once or twice a year in this cave and collected a total of 1,322 samples. From these samples, we detected 293 highly diverse coronaviruses, of which 284 were designated alpha coronaviruses and 9 were designated beta coronaviruses on the basis of partial RDRP sequences. All of the 9 beta coronaviruses are SARS-CoVs, end quote. The Wuhan Institute of Virology did not disclose more information about these other 8 SARS-CoVs.
It's unbelievable. I mean, it seems, without a question that the mine in the Muzhang County, it remains to this day one of the closest clues yet found to the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic. At least that's what I'm getting from everything that's being thrown at me right now.
Yeah, it's right. I mean, it is the place where the virus most likely co-matching COVID-19 was found, period.
Yeah, a virus that we now know for a fact was extensively studied in the Wuhan laboratory before the detection of the COVID-19 outbreak, if I have the timeline right.
You do, and it gets worse for the Wuhan Institute of Virology. 4 months after the Nature addendum, the Wuhan Institute of Virology appeared to revise its stories. It told members of the WHO-China Global Study of Origins of COVID-19, and I'm now quoting, quote, the reported illnesses associated with the miners, according to the Wuhan Institute of Virology experts, were more likely explained by fungal infections acquired when removing a thick layer of guano, end quote.
Yeah, guano, bat poop, essentially.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So how could the Wuhan Institute of Virology, be so specific, so confident, and now proven so wrong? Yet again, it seems like the authorities, and specifically the Wuhan Institute of Virology, they're misleading the world here. That's what it really feels like to me. That's not just what it feels like to me. It's what I see, to correct myself. Yeah. So I guess then from there, I got to ask, what do you think actually happened? How did this actually play out?
I mean,
this cloak and dagger stuff.
With all the obfuscation of the Chinese government, it's hard to know for sure. And there's still too much uncertainty and too much that is concealed by the government of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In this podcast, we've tried to lay out the evidence and follow it wherever it leads, but it has not led us to a definitive conclusion. But I think there is evidence towards justifying a worldwide investigation that if China doesn't do it, they should be kicked out of the World Trade Organization. I think that there's enough evidence for that to justify that move, which of course isn't happening because of the money involved, but whatever.
Yeah, I mean, like at the start of the pandemic, I don't think either of us, really thought the virus came from a laboratory leak. That sounds like ludicrous. We both thought a natural event would soon emerge as by far the most likely explanation.
I
For
think that's a
anything.
fair assessment. In the
Yeah,
first month of 2020, the start of COVID-19, it seemed to follow the recipe of the first SARS outbreak. I agree with that. Where a chain of infections, from animals to people quickly became apparent. However, I now think it's very highly probable that the pandemic did result from the work of scientists, either when collecting samples in the field with the multiple expeditions from the Wuhan Institute of Virology and other virology centers going down to the copper mine, or when working with those samples in a laboratory, most probably the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But as we've seen, Wuhan is the virology center of China, and so it could have been any number of virology labs in Wuhan, although the probable one, the one I'd bet my money on clearly is the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
yeah. It seems pretty clear now that a lab leak hypothesis, it should have been transformed from the conspiracy theory to quite a plausible hypothesis, worthy of some credible investigation, worldwide, with the obstruction by the Chinese authorities. It seems like that jump should have been made sooner.
Right-wing conspiracy theories. It's always right-wing. So it's right-wing conspiracy theories by the global community. But for sure, yeah, the world deserves to know the truth here. And, there's push now to a certain degree towards the view you've just cited.
Yeah.
In furtherance of that view, on August 27, 2021, the U.S. government's intelligence agencies finally published a brief declassified summary of the results of their inquiry into the origin of COVID-19. The agencies were agreed that the virus was not a bioweapon, and they thought with low confidence that it was probably not the product of genetic engineering. They also thought that Chinese officials had no foreknowledge of the pandemic, but complained that China continues to hinder the global investigation, resists sharing information, and blames other countries. Although they didn't say we should start pushing for an investigation, they conveniently left that out. Beyond that, they could not reach agreement. Tellingly, one agency did reach a conclusion with moderate confidence and said that the first infection came about as a result of a laboratory-associated incident, probably involving experimentation, animal handling, or sampling by the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So that's something.
So then I guess asking you, what is your assessment of this finding by our intelligence agencies? What do you think about all this?
To quote Shakespeare, much to do about nothing. My view of that inquiry was that it solved nothing, added little, but it did reinforce the need to take both natural and lab origin hypothesis theory seriously, and to globally demand an investigation, investigate both theories fairly and properly, and to act as if both could happen again.
Wait, now hold on, wait. A year ago, it would have been, a cataclysmic news that the U.S. government thought that there was a fairly high level playing field between natural spillover and a laboratory leak. At least I think so.
Yeah. However, by August 2021, much of the American public, I think, and international media had already shifted subtly to regard both hypotheses as plausible, and the laboratory origin was no longer extremely unlikely or a right-wing conspiracy theory, as it had been condemned by numerous science and experts in 2020, as we referred earlier to the Lancet letter. So the report was not that brave or cutting edge at the time, which is typical for government bureaucracy.
All right, fair rebuttal, but for the first year of the pandemic, as the death toll, just kept going up. It just kept climbing. It seemed like every day it was just getting worse. The debate about the origin of the virus, it stayed on a single track from what I saw. With rare exceptions, here and there. The natural spillover hypothesis from an animal was, assumed by most scientists, governments, officials, broadcasters, journalists. You couldn't escape it. It was kind of everywhere. And by far, it was most likely explanation of how the virus, was first infected by a human being, not an animal. That's just what I saw, day in and day out.
Yeah. Taking their cue from Dr. Peter Daszak's Lancet letter, which we referred to in February 2020, and Dr. Christian Anderson's Nature Medicine article in March that year, many public figures of influence, in the West assumed that the idea of a laboratory leak was a fantasy of a few far-right politicians. In the article, in its insert, and we're going to quote it here, abstract specifically stated, our analyses clearly show that SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, is not a laboratory construct or a purposefully manipulated virus. In other words, did not involve gain of function research. So let's look at this article site for a moment. The proximal origin of COVID-19. There's your author, Christian Anderson. And look at the accesses. 5.73 million accesses, 2,640 citations. So you tell people when they want to hear, boy, they'll cite you. So, at this point in time, to have that many citations on that article, that's ominous. That's ominous. It doesn't seem like science is being too objective or clear-minded here. And that's Christian Anderson, and I don't give much credence to this article in Nature Medicine. So that's a scientific journal, accessed by millions, cited by thousands. So
yeah, it seems like the Chinese sources were even more emphatic.
Look, though, the difference is I don't expect the truth from a communist government. Do you? This is Chernobyl all over again. The same kind of garbage. Guano on top of misdirection on top of more guano. So no.
Yeah, but I mean, to be fair, it was just the communists, but also our most trusted in the scientific establishment. They were the ones who reported. They told journalists that the laboratory leak hypothesis was a conspiracy theory from the right. Just to give a small anecdote, I remember Jon Stewart, who was very left wing. He came out in a very comedic way, said this very thing that we're saying right now. But even then, there was talk of oh, he's being red pilled a little bit, leaning right, becoming that. So it's just, I can see why this all developed.
I mean, that's a good argument. I concede that, few reporters or comedians like Stewart or politicians know enough biology to come to a different conclusion, and most are content to take it on trust because we're not scientists, and that's a fair shot, because if to do otherwise would be a huge concession to politicians like President Trump, who had a very different view, and you don't want to be associated with him, even though he was right in this regard. So
yeah, I assume that science journalists, unlike political or business journalists, are generally not in the habit of challenging their own sources.
No, but show them no mercy. The uncomfortable gaps in their story were growing wider by the hour, not narrower. So you might show mercy for the first few months, Levi, but we're talking over a 2.5 year period, man. Come on. For anybody following closely, the anomalies were piling up, as was the evidence that quite a lot of information was being held back by communist China, and the reporters were not condemning communist China quick enough and hard enough. Now our scientific community, our global elite, failed us miserably, immorally, unethically at a global level. They were not rational or dogged in the pursuit of truth. They were more akin to cowardly bureaucrats mired in groupthink. They should have 1984 tattooed on all their foreheads and be ashamed of themselves in this life and the next.
Well, no one can deny that few, if any, laboratory leak stories, broke through into the mainstream media, which showed magnificent curiosity, from what I can tell, with some notable exceptions. Within the World Health Organizations and its advisors, only a few publicly expressed skepticism.
Jamie Metz of the World Health, to give Jamie credit, the World Health Organization expressed skepticism. But go ahead, Levi, go.
Okay. So yeah, sorry, of course, Jamie. But I was going to also mention Yuri Dagin's essay.
Yeah, his essay.
In the Medium. Yeah, in April 2020. It was called Lab-Made SARS-CoV-2 Genealogy Through the Lens of Gain of Function Research. This caught the attention of plenty of online readers, but was just kind of ignored, just kind of shoved aside.
Yeah, that was an awesome essay, and that should not have been ignored at all. And it was kind of wrong that it was so ignored. But also there's Milton Lightenberg's essay in June 2020 in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Did SARS-CoV-2 virus arise from a bat coronavirus research program in a Chinese laboratory? Very possibly. Had limited impact. Rowan Jacobson's profile of Alina Chan in Boston Magazine in September 2020. Could COVID-19 have escaped from a lab? Few follow-ups. Nicholson Baker's long essay in New York Magazine in January 2021, the lab leak hypothesis, made a few waves, and that's about it. So I'm sure I'm not catching everybody who went against the wave here. These are some really credible, notable people that deserve kudos. But by and large, the media was overall institutionally, qualitatively, and systemically cowardly and pathetic.
Yeah, and essays exploring, gain of function research, the leakiness of laboratories, or the bat virus hunting expeditions of the EcoHealth Alliance appeared, but it's mostly obscure. It's in low traffic outlets. From what I can tell, their authors are mostly unpaved mavericks who cared little for their own reputations. So the scientific consensus, held, I would say.
Yeah, it did, and Twitter, which I don't appreciate their censorship, but Twitter did have a lively debate that continued where brave internet sleuths, usually unnamed, not only explored every angle, but their numbers grew. And a handful of senior scientists, to their credit, joined their conversation. One country that I think did better than any other country around the world is France, where and I'm quoting the group on Twitter, Paris Group, crystallized thanks to the dedicated effort of, forgive me for butchering this name, Dr. Virginie Courtier or Gozo of the Institut Jacques Monod in Paris. So credit to the French on that one.
Yeah, and on the toady side of the fence, the farcical World Health Organization, press conference in Beijing in February, I think it was 24th, back in 2020, they convinced almost nobody that frozen food was more likely source of the pandemic than laboratory experiment gone wrong,
But even that debacle, mainstream media and scientific leadership largely steered clear of giving the laboratory leak hypothesis any oxygen or credibility.
But I mean, I got to know, because you would know this probably more than me. You had done much more research. Like, why did this happen?
Part of the problem was the confusion of two different hypotheses, that the virus was deliberately engineered as a bioweapon or vaccine, or that it was a natural, or at least mostly natural virus that accidentally escaped by infecting somebody during field work or an experiment. Neither Dr. Peter Daszak or Dr. Anderson made such a clear distinction in their publications, using arguments mostly against the first idea, but implying that this ruled out both types of laboratory leak scenarios, when it didn't. So some of this, I think, analytical clarity by all parties would have helped.
Yeah, that is certainly the way many journalists, read them.
Moreover, look, many of the essays on the other side of the debate fell into the same trap, focusing mainly on the evidence for deliberate manipulation of the virus with malintention rather than accidental or negligent release with a subsequent Chinese government cover-up, which I think is more probable. I think that was an issue. A document I found quite revealing was, Stephen Quay's lengthy manuscript on Zenodo in January 2021, titled "A Bayesian Analysis," and I'm a big fan of Bayesian analysis, concludes beyond a reasonable doubt that SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, is not a natural zoonosis, but instead is laboratory derived, which suggested a vaccine trial, gain of function research that went wrong.
I guess, was the slowness in publishing, these cutting edge views in scientific journals based on anything credible?
No, I don't think so. It became somewhat of a pattern that scientists struggled to get scientific journals to publish their analysis that COVID-19 was certainly human-made or probably human-made. So why that global institutional resistance, I think, is because implicitly they knew if it was gain of function research, which is happening globally, the outcry by humanity globally would be unending.
Yeah, so it was just easy to polarize the debate and refract it through a political lens.
Of course. Remember the elitist Washington Post accusing Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton, and I quote, "fanning the embers of a conspiracy theory that has been repeatedly debunked by experts." And so the Washington Post once again proved themselves to be fools.
Yeah, so like in the mind of the Washington Post, what was Arkansas Senator Cotton guilty of?
Senator Cotton of Arkansas had the audacity to call for an open-minded investigation of all possibilities, but the elites didn't stop there. The New York Times said the Wuhan laboratory had been, and I quote, the focus of unfounded conspiracy theories promoted by the Trump administration, as if an accident could be a conspiracy. That's an analytical anomaly. That's a logical fallacy. It's an incredibly stupid analysis by the New York Times, and certainly not its first. Not to be outdone, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the other elite government-supported nonprofit tax-sponsored media outlet, NPR, reported that, and I quote, scientists debunk lab accident theory, end quote, when actually they had barely rebutted the genetic engineered theory.
Yeah,
So this is some pretty strong mainstream media being proven flagrantly wrong, and stupid in their analysis.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that, in May of 2021, the dam just kind of crumbled with that letter, in Science, the journal Science, where 18 scientists, signed off on it.
I mean, yeah, in Nicholas Wade's long essay in Medium, Origin of COVID, Following the Clues, went more viral than Dagan's or Baker's had. So, and I'm going to give the readers, I hope they'll read the article. And there's a few in here I think they should read. I know it's time consuming, but they're really good. And here's the URL on Nicholas Wade's article.
Yeah. I mean, I was astounded when I went back and you gave this to me, and I read the Wall Street Journal detailing its intelligence report describing, the three Wuhan Institute of Virology researchers needing hospital treatment back in November of 2019. I mean, that's when I knew this, this discussion we're having right now, this podcast, it had something important to say.
And, I belittled the Post and the Times and NPR, and I have no problems belittling the Washington Journal either, but I mean, the Wall Street Journal, but they kudos to them for doing that article. So, there were exceptions to the rule. So the Wall Street Journal, I just want to say that, kudos on that article. So that was a step in the right direction. But by the start of June 2021, Dr. Anthony Fauci, conveniently enough, altered his stance, conceding that he was not convinced of a natural origin. A flood of coverage of the laboratory leak hypothesis erupted on newspapers, TV, radio, online. Even National Public Radio, NPR, suddenly showed a keen interest in the origin of COVID. The gain of function controversies and whether Dr. Fauci and the NIH had knowingly funded such research in Wuhan, it's taken central stage in America, with Kentucky Senator Rand Paul leading the charge.
Yeah, so the censorship, that marked the coverage, kind of unraveled.
I mean, and quickly, Facebook reversed its policy of censoring and labeling as misinformation any post that discussed a laboratory origin of COVID-19. How much damage Facebook did in that by 2 years censoring as if they were doctors and virologists and unilaterally making decisions on what was science and what wasn't. I mean, obviously, that was immoral and unethical. They did that, and that needs to be punished at an institutional level so it doesn't happen again. That's part of solving the problem, is solving Facebook's actions, and they've admitted doing it. So now we just have to effectuate an institutional remedy. Vox quietly edited past articles that had dismissed a lab origin out of hand. So that's kind of sneaky and wrong and unethical. Fact checkers, used by media, re-edited their articles and retracted their claims. And we can get specific here. For example, PolitiFact, concerning the criticism of Li Meng Yan's work, wrote, and I'm quoting, "We are removing this fact check from our database pending a more thorough review." Ian Beryl of the Mail summed all this up quite well by writing an incredibly good article detailing the role of media in refusing to consider, let alone publish, anything that cast doubt on the natural spillover hypothesis. And I quote, "The failures of both new and traditional media coalescing around the comfort blanket of the scientific establishment and their loathing of Trump should provoke serious reflection."
Yeah, I mean, even the New York Times, they finally caved in and published a deep dive into the possibility of a laboratory-based origin of COVID-19, I believe by Zeynep
Tufekci.
That's the name. Yeah. He wrote that, and I think I have the quote right here. Let me just pull it up. All right, yeah. So Now, for the second time in 50 years, there are questions about whether we are dealing with a pandemic caused by scientific research. The first pandemic refers to the 1977 H1N1 influenza outbreak that was deemed to be the result of flawed vaccine trials.
Yeah, by August, even the Chinese state-controlled media appeared to have given up trying to persuade the world of a natural spillover explanation and started to claim that a laboratory leak was indeed likely. Except critically, the lab leak happened at the University of North Carolina. Remember the Dr. Barrett, North Carolina connection. It's coming back now.
Hold on, wait. I haven't heard of this one, man. We've discussed a few things, before this podcast. A little peek behind the curtain. We do discuss a few things, but I don't know anything about this.
Yeah. On August 9th, 2021, Global Times published an article arguing that, and I quote, frequent accidents attributed to lax safety procedures at Dr. Barrett's lab in Chapel Hill pointed to that location as the likely source of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I quote again, with a mixed record on safety, the US's ambiguous double standard attitude toward the COVID-19 lab leak theory has led many in the public to become increasingly suspicious. It keeps smearing Chinese labs for leaking the virus while attempting to cover up its domestic situation.
So let me guess, how a leak in North Carolina might have caused a pandemic in China, it did not explain.
It didn't, but I think the Chinese government might be signaling Barrick's prior research with the bat lady in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and perhaps some component of the gain of function research was done by Dr. Barrick at the University of North Carolina because it was BSL-4 protocol done. And the Wuhan Institute of Virology at the time in question from 2012 to 2018, when they were probably doing the gain of function research, was at most BSL-2, and that's a level of protocol for safety when doing research with viruses. It has since then become a BSL-4, and the Chinese Communist government is big on telling us that the Wuhan Institute of Virology is BSL-4, but please keep in mind, viewers, that it was not a BSL-4 at the time. It was a BSL-2, then it became a BSL-3 and a BSL-4. So something's going on here with the Chinese. It does look like a garbage attack on Dr. Barrick and the University of North Carolina, but remember, he did do research with the bat lady at the time in question. And so there could be some international political signaling to the Chinese government that, hey, you are somewhat complicit in this. Any negligence on our part, maybe you didn't give us the right protocol. Maybe you shouldn't have let us do the research here when we were BSL-2. We should have been BSL-4. Maybe you're BSL-4 at the University of North Carolina and you screwed some of it up. Maybe it's all garbage. I don't know, but this is the kind of stuff an investigation should find out. And this is in our own waters. So this part of the investigation, we could easily find out. So,
no way, man. I mean, try to keep my cherry so to be clear. I mean, to me, the attempts by the Chinese government to deflect blame had by now descended into a farce.
It can, on that one with Dr. Barrett, could be farce, might not be. We need to investigate. But here's a situation where I think it looks like farce, but man, I don't know, but it could be. On August 10th, the Swiss embassy in Beijing took to Twitter to point out that a scientist named Wilson Edwards, supposedly based in Switzerland, widely amplified in Chinese state media since July 24th, when he joined Facebook to post a complaint about the origin tracing of COVID-19 and American pressure on the WHO. The guy simply didn't exist. He didn't exist. So
he didn't exist. Wait, so I assume Wilson Edwards, he just disappeared from Facebook soon afterwards?
He did. And maybe he only existed in the mind of Chinese intelligence agencies, but maybe not. This is why, yet again, it's kind of bizarre, but we don't know, but yeah, he just disappeared.
I mean, it may seem farcical, to us here, in the USA, but in China, anyone who went against, such stories, would be in huge trouble, man, huge trouble.
Yeah, I mean, any whistleblowers who try to bring light to the nature of COVID-19 as it emerged in Wuhan, they're done for. Two young activists, Chen Mai and Kai Wei, were found guilty by the Chaoyang District People's Court on August 13th. And I quote, for picking quarrels and stirring up trouble. They were sentenced to prison for a year and 3 months each, though released for time served. Their crime, creating a repository on the website GitHub of articles that had appeared online in China, in which included reports, interviews, and personal stories about the early weeks of the pandemic in Wuhan. And a citizen journalist, Zhang Zan, was sentenced to 4 years in prison for daring to report on China's government's shortcomings in handling the Wuhan outbreak.
Man, I mean, it just seems, the Communist Party handled the COVID-19 the same way they handle most things in history,
Or dissent, quarantined to death. By the way, I forgot to mention earlier that the 3 Wuhan Institute virology workers who fell ill in November 2019 were said to have worked in the bat coronavirus laboratory and have symptoms that suggested COVID-19, specifically ground glass opacities in the lungs and a loss of smell.
I mean, even today, it still bothers me. Much of the debate, around COVID-19, its origin, it assumes that the laboratory leak, theory, it has to prove itself. It has to prove itself before it can be taken seriously in any regard, which is a little silly to me.
It is, by contract, natural spillover is the default assumption, which does not have to prove anything. This holds any laboratory leak theory to a higher standard of proof than any natural theory. The influential article, Proximal Origin paper, March 2020, by Dr. Christian Anderson and his colleagues took this line, focusing on the lack of evidence for an accident rather than the evidence for natural origin. And while I admit that a furon cleavage site could have arisen naturally, it is highly unlikely and not probable.
Yeah, I remember, I believe it was the Chinese, in China, the World Health Organization joint study, them together, I think it was February 2022, 21, a press conference. I believe it said that since they did not see the evidence for a leak, they therefore did not need to investigate, any possibility of it, further than that. It just wasn't worth their time.
I mean, it's utterly nonsensical, and I'm being polite.
And Emir, you're not always polite.
No, not when it gets this bad. I mean, millions of people died. Come on.
Yeah, obviously, yes, of course. I guess, why should the burden of proof, be with those who posit a laboratory leak? Why do you think that is?
For starters, to our knowledge, there has been no major pandemic caused by a laboratory leak. So COVID-19 would be a first. But the times have changed radically since we have entered an era where scientists are collecting, sequencing, and manipulating viruses at an unprecedented scale worldwide and engaging institutionally at a global level, gain of function research.
I mean, I've heard of mistakes with viruses before, though.
But there have already been numerous near misses around the world, given the powerful circumstantial evidence that Wuhan was not a particularly likely place for a natural epidemic of a SARS-like virus from which to originate, but instead it's extremely obvious place for a laboratory leaked one to start, since it has more virology labs than anywhere else in China, and it's their epicenter for the study of viruses. I mean, look, it's reasonable to expect both hypotheses to be put to a similarly rigorous test. That's can't argue.
I hear you. I mean, I just think that even if the burden of proof, was on the laboratory leak initially, it's shifted since then. The closest relative of COVID-19, RATG13, it got to Wuhan via scientists shifts. It shifts the burden of the proof in mind, I think.
I mean, mind you, I concur. And I think that the viability of the lab leak theory increases given the obfuscation and misdirection in the story of the Mojang copper miners, which we've gone over maybe ad nauseum. I don't know. But given the existence of the other 8 COVID-19 like viruses from the mine, given the missing database of more than 22,000 entries, given the long record of virus collection, coronavirus genetic engineering, and animal infection experiments in Wuhan in the various virology labs located there, but especially at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And the lab leak theory is more credible also given the track record of scientists inserting furin cleavage sites in the viruses and the failure to find a furin cleavage site in another SARS-like virus, despite widespread searches in China and other countries. And given the failure of the wet market spillover hypothesis to find any definitive evidence, no intermediate host, no immediate precursor to COVID-19, no animal samples found to be positive for COVID-19 ever anywhere worldwide, not one. These factors may not have proved the laboratory leak hypothesis, but they have very clearly undermined the position of the natural spillover scenario as the default hypothesis. So, I mean, at the end of the day, given the aforementioned, the lab leak theory is standing tall and proud.
All right, that was very eloquent, monologue. But just to play devil's advocate real quick, like what if one day we discover that COVID-19 originated by natural spillover? Like, what if that actually happens?
I mean, I'll quote someone else to counter. In the words of the journalist Rowan Jacobson, and I quote, "Despite 15 years of coronavirus hunting and testing by the Wuhan Institute of Virology, it was helpless to prevent a pandemic in its own backyard. If that's a coincidence, it's one of the great ironies of history," end quote. And nonetheless, I grant it would be a cruel coincidence if true.
Yeah, maybe one day the origin we found to have been, a farm of COVID-19 infected ferret badgers or a shipment of, traumatized pangolins, those anteaters. See, I learned something, and, that were quickly destroyed, by farmers or smugglers to avoid being blamed for the pandemic. And maybe someday, something at that specific, could be found out. Who knows?
And perhaps it may emerge that the zoonotic origins had in fact been tracked down by Chinese scientists early in the pandemic and covertly destroyed or covered up so that the Chinese government could try and sell us the frozen foods, not from China origins hypothesis. In this case, we would have maligned the very scientists who are working painstakingly to prevent pandemics in Wuhan. But no, look, at the end of the day, if you live in Transylvania, near a big dark castle, and you suddenly hate sunlight and churches and have a craving for blood, it's because you've been bitten by a vampire. The proximity to Dracula is proof enough for the lab leak theory to have evidentiary dominance until proven otherwise, period.
So thanks to the Chinese government handling of COVID-19 to this day, the sparse evidence available demand the natural and laboratory-based origins are both treated as equally likely events.
Look. Even if advocates for an investigation into the laboratory leak hypothesis are eventually found to be wrong, I still think it's imperative that a true investigation from global sources take place for many reasons discussed in this podcast already. The warning about gain-of-function research is massive. The worries about bringing viruses from the field to urban laboratories where accidents do happen. The anxieties about disturbing bats and other wild animal populations in the name of sciences. These are all still valid, even if COVID-19 did emerge without the help of research activities in Wuhan, China.
Yeah, and what if we discover that the COVID-19 originated from a laboratory leak? Like what then? Like what if that actually comes out?
Well, it would have been much easier on scientists, science writers, journalists, and the public if we could be sure that COVID-19 had spilled over into humans free of any laboratory involvement.
Yeah, but if it is proven one day that COVID-19, somehow escaped from a laboratory, science's reputations would suffer, from a huge blow, I would assume, and that explains, the institutional denial worldwide by science, of this, lab leak. To me, that's kind of clear that that's what happened.
I mean, yeah, since research that was previously thought to be life-saving and pandemic preventing would suddenly stand exposed as the very source of a worldwide pandemic is the antithesis of science. So I get your point. The almost 2 decades of research that followed the SARS epidemic in 2002 and 3 failed to keep its promises of preventing the next pandemic and yielding broad spectrum SARS vaccines or therapeutics in time for the COVID-19 outbreak. I mean, the face of science is wrecked, and we alluded to that earlier, with the MIT editor.
So do you think like virologists might find their grants terminated or at the very least diminished, their experiments banned or heavily regulated, what have you, and the reputations, potentially tarnished, after all this?
I mean, grant money would shrink, and money's money, at the end of the day, follow the money, And some might argue that science is generally regulated more tightly and conducted to higher standards outside China, but that will go far, it won't go far, I think, with the general public, especially considering the early vehement denials of the possibility of a laboratory leak by outspoken Western scientists and science journalists. If the lab leak theory holds, it's not just communist China that falls. Western science bootlicking of the initial theory that it was from, snakes on down to a natural spillover, that they posited and clung to for 2 years while the world died and children turned dumb from lockdowns, is hellaciously damning. The justified backlash from this will also likely expand to the field of virology to impact other hotly controversial areas in science, which is why Science Worldwide would rather move on, and you've alluded to that. Secretly knowing what it now knows, it seems to hate the light of truth. And so I think without an investigation, it's going to prevent a lot of healing that needs to go on and preclude practical, institutional, remedial work that needs to be done for the next pandemic, because there'll be another one.
Yeah, so like at this point then, I think this, reassessment will happen to some small degree, if laboratory science is fully exonerated. In this case, scientists, politicians, the media, and the public have seen that even if it didn't happen on this occasion, a dangerous virus could one day escape from a laboratory experiment.
Especially when gain of function research, is done in labs not qualified for such research as was done in Wuhan. As I said earlier, it was only later raised to a BSL-4 protocol. Experiments to alter viruses and make them potentially more dangerous, to come up with a vaccine anticipating a mutation, even unintentionally, if it goes awry, it needs to be subject to a new round of review and debate. I mean, a whole new assessment of cost-benefit analysis needs to be done after the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, although it has been demonstrated again and again, not the least with the near miraculous development of novel infectious vaccines in 2020. We had a few flubs there. That science is vital to the future of humanity. That's important to remember.
I mean, the vaccines that we came up with off the fly, under the pressure, within a year or so, yes, I would concede that, no argument. It's paramount for scientists to play leading roles in the investigation of the origin of the pandemic. No argument. Hence the world's deep and profound disappointment at the way so many scientists close their minds and close ranks, like the Lancet letter we alluded to earlier, against the lab leak hypothesis so prematurely, so early in the pandemic, or at least showed far too little scientific skepticism and scientific curiosity on the issue, when scientific curiosity was exactly what was most needed at the time.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, the world would have to negotiate a tougher, more transparent regime for regulating research on pathogens.
And this can't be done without scientists. But now I think it's got to be done alongside non-scientist stakeholders who aren't affected by potential grant money loss, and their reputations are not so at stake. The founding contributions from internet sleuths and outsiders, several were scientists in their own right, to be clear. It can't be denied and should be celebrated, but we need to go forward at an institutional level, and we can't rely on internet sleuths for scientific truths in the next pandemic. I mean, that's just plain crazy.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I would agree. It is scientists who must prove capable of credibility and transparently tracking the origins of COVID-19, no matter where that leads us. They have to be the ones to do it.
Yeah, but Levi, in my mind, there's a far more serious implication for scientists and humanity if world governments and organizations like the WHO, the World Health Organization, from having ignored or dismissed the lab leak hypothesis when it mattered most. I mean, regimes around the world that are carrying out military/civilian dual-use pathogen research, and that would be much of the planet, as well as terrorists who are also considering the use of bioweapons, are paying attention to what happened institutionally at a global level. And not only will they have noticed the vast scale of disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, they will also have noticed how easily the Chinese authorities dismissed a lab leak theory and neutered an international investigation with the willing help of so many alleged scientific experts worldwide and mainstream media, to which we've already alluded.
Yeah, bad actors may have learned that they can easily get away with the creation and release of dangerous pathogens. I'll give you that. With an unpredictably large impact on their target populations. This is true, whether or not a laboratory leak was actually responsible in the case of COVID-19. But we do have, a number of avenues to the truth as to the origins of COVID-19, do we not?
Well, I mean, look, since China's never going to help us on the issue, for which I believe they should be kicked out of the World Trade Organization, I think we have to conduct a systemic and transparent review of the crucial information that exists outside of China. We got to at least start with what can we know outside of China to which we have access to? What information and data can we get?
All right. What does that look like to you then? Explain that just a little
Well,
bit.
you got to start with the EcoHealth Alliance with Peter Daszak. You have to start there. The EcoHealth Alliance, proud of having closely collaborated with the Wuhan Institute of Virology on the surveillance of bat viruses for many years, must possess some data or correspondence that could be helpful in evaluating the likelihood of a laboratory origin. And assertions such as those by the president of the EcoHealth Alliance, Dr. Daszak, that he had seen the Wuhan Institute of Virology's pathogen database and that it contained no information of relevance, it's just not acceptable in the light of the extreme stakes involved. We do not have to take that man's word for it, and a subpoena and getting that information, whether he likes it or not, and deposing him under penalty of perjury, anything less than that is just ridiculous.
Are there other potential sources we should look into then?
Well, he's the main one, but as late as September 2021, new and potentially concerning information from parties inside the US continue to be released to the public without any sense of urgency. So, for example, at the end of July, the NIH had written a letter in response to a senator revealing that during the time it had funded the EcoHealth Alliance, more chimeric coronavirus work had been proposed, this time involving MERS, a related novel bat coronavirus that went to camels in 2012, to evaluate their behavior and animal infection models at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So the latest clues have indeed emerged outside China. On September 2021, Labor Day in the US, The Intercept published more than 900 pages of freshly released documents describing the NIH funded research proposals and project updates by the EcoHealth Alliance and the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That's significant.
Yeah, I think I recall that the Intercept had to litigate to get these documents, which they had requested 1 year before. I think it was under the Freedom of Information Act when that was all.
That's right. Of course,
yeah.
EcoHealth didn't give it up easily, for reasons, obvious reasons. They have not been scientific, credible, or transparent. EcoHealth Alliance has been the opposite of engaging in scientific investigation and transparency, the opposite. But the contents would undoubtedly have alarmed the public if released in early 2020. But by September 2021, many of the key pieces of information had already been, scavenged by internet sleuths and scientists, carefully poring over the dozens of research publications by the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The documents confirm that the work on SARS-like coronaviruses has been conducted at BSL-2 and BSL-3 level protocols, which we've alluded to earlier in the podcast, that the Wuhan Institute of Virology had at their fingertips a wide variety of boutique cell lines obtained from bats, primates, humans, and other animals, which were used for the isolation and study of novel viruses that other virology laboratories do not possess. So they did it there. that they had purposefully sampled thousands of animals and human beings in rural China and in live animal markets that they expected to be at high risk of exposure to SARS-like viruses, that there were protocols for sampling bats, civets, raccoons, dogs, and other potential intermediate hosts of SARS-like coronaviruses, with a focus on avoiding being bitten by the animals while collecting samples, that the Wuhan Institute of Virology brought these samples from spillover hotspots in southern China, places where wildlife trade, hunting, and bat guano collection is common. They brought it back to Wuhan for in-depth study in the attempted isolation or synthesis of novel viruses. The scientists there acknowledged that field work involves the highest risk of exposure to SARS and other COVID viruses while working in caves with high bat density overhead, and the potential for fecal dust to be inhaled. There is also some risk of exposure to pathogens or physical injury while handling bats, civets, rodents, or other animals, their blood samples, or their excreta. One important revelation was that the Wuhan Institute of Virology had kept records of people who tested positive for signs of infection by animal viruses, and also tracked research-related incidents such as being bitten by bats or market animals. So we can start with, does EcoHealth Alliance have access to these medical records and data on animal bites suffered by researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology? And is any government going to give a damn and find out, like the US government? Why don't they help?
Only one government seems to have that kind of power, Amir, right now, and that current administration doesn't really seem too motivated, to answer that question.
Motivated, it's not even a topic of discussion. It's not even a topic of discussion by this administration. So, in addition, the documents showed that the Wuhan Institute of Virology had shared with their US collaborators that by mid-2018, they had obtained results from testing chimeric SARS-like coronaviruses in humanized mice at BSL-3, potentially on the Wuhan University campus instead of at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. In one case, a chimeric SARS-like virus not previously disclosed was found to replicate more efficiently by 2 or 3 orders of magnitude in the lungs of humanized mice than the non-chimeric version of the virus, and without causing observable weight loss, which is a way to gauge the severity of disease in mice. Other chimeric SARS-like viruses were also shown to grow much better in humanized mice lungs compared to non-chimeric viruses, while retaining the ability to sicken the mice, causing up to 20% body weight loss by the 6th-day post-infection.
All right, so there's a lot of information there. So, I guess, what is the key significance of these particular findings?
Okay, these preliminary findings from 2018, they speak to how unpredictable the results of generating chimeric viruses can be. It's dangerous. You're not in control. It gets out of hand. It can go anywhere.
Okay.
You might get a virus that is less deadly, but more transmissible. Or you might get a virus that is both more deadly and more transmissible. I mean, you're playing with nuclear reactor fire here. It's unclear if more humanized mouse experiments had been conducted after these striking findings, and if other naturally isolated or chimeric SARS-like viruses had been tested in this animal model, perhaps later in civets. To make things worse, in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, they're known to have conducted classified research, and it has an institutional policy on protecting the confidentiality of work relating to state secrets and research secrets. So because of that, anything that goes awry, the Chinese government can immediately lock down and say it's confidential, precluding the Wuhan Institute of Virology, even if they wanted to, from exposing any mishaps or acts of negligence that occurred if it involved a state secret. And obviously, a worldwide pandemic starting in China, the Chinese government would view as a state secret.
I mean, so in other words, the Wuhan Institute of Virology seems to work hand in hand with the People's Liberation Army.
It does. They're with the CDC in the same city, and obviously it's all connected to the Chinese Communist Party. But it's not just China. To be fair, another relevant research proposal by Dr. Peter Daszak, yet again of the EcoHealth Alliance, requesting 14.2 million in funding, and was submitted in March 2018 to the U.S. Department of Defense's R&D agency, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, known as DARPA. Its subcontractors included, here we go, Dr. Ralph Barrick from North Carolina,
Yeah.
Lin Wang, and Shi Zhengli. We referred to Dr. Shi Zhengli before. The application was ultimately unsuccessful, but its contents laid bare their extensive roadmap for collecting and experimenting with SARS-like viruses with pandemic potential. One of the criticisms of the proposal by the DARPA program manager was that, although the approach potentially involved gain-of-function research, it did, and I quote, not mention or assess potential risks of gain-of-function research and dual-use research of concern.
I mean, basically, it laid out for me, like, what did this proposal involve?
The proposal was to test the spillover potential of viruses that it described as, and I quote, a clear and present danger to our military and to global health security, using a range of infection experiments, including in captive bats in the lab, humanized mice, and batonized mice, that is, mice with bat immune cells. The early 2018 document described plans for a point that Dr. Daszak had denied in 2020, namely that wild-caught Rhinophilus bats were to be kept and experimented with at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Further, it was revealed that by that time, the EcoHealth Alliance and its collaborators had already found more than 180 unique SARS-like viruses across approximately 10,000 samples.
So basically, COVID-19, these bats, were kept in the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
I mean, it seems so. Most importantly, the proposal contained the first written statements by the EcoHealth Alliance that it and its collaborators had plans to insert cleavage sites into engineered SARS-CoV viruses, new coronaviruses. And I quote, we will analyze all SARS-CoV viruses gene sequences for appropriately conserved proteolytic cleavage sites in S2 and for the presence of potential furin cleavage sites. We will introduce appropriate human-specific cleavage sites and evaluate growth potential in viro, monkey kidneys, and human airway cultures. Worse still, if functional cleavage sites were discovered in rare SARS-like viruses detected in their sequencing data, they plan to introduce these into new virus strains in the lab. In other words, this early 2018 proposal told us that the EcoHealth Alliance and the Wuhan Institute of Virology were in possession of a growing semi-private collection of SARS-like viruses. They had intended to expand their recombinant virus infection experiments across a range of cells and animals. They had also delineated a workflow for identifying novel cleavage sites and inserting these into novel spikes and novel SARS-like viruses in the lab.
Wait, this is, I'm jumping the gun. This seems circumstantially damning. Like, why didn't Dr. Fauci ever mention any of this? Or why wasn't this mentioned at all by anybody?
Mention it. Dr. Fauci denied and stonewalled this from the get-go, something I think Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky will hopefully soon resolve.
All right, so what is the relationship then with Dr. Zhengli Shi, if I said that correctly? What's that doctor's relationship? The bat lady. That's who it is. Who essentially, ran the Wuhan Institute of Virology in the United States. What's the relationship there?
Well, we've already referred to her research with Dr. Barrick, and here they are, Dr. Barrick of North Carolina and the bat lady doing this grant with EcoHealth, $14.4 million, which was denied, but it almost looked like they were trying to create COVID-19 in a lab, for God's sake. So even though the grant was denied, it doesn't mean the work wasn't done. But her work back to the United States, straight up, her work was funded by the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID acronym, and a part of the U.S. National Institute of Health, NIH.
Yeah, so since the grant proposals that funded her work are a matter of public record, did they specify exactly what she planned to do with this money?
Yes, the grants were assigned to the prime contractor, yet again, Dr. Daszak, yet again of the EcoHealth Alliance, who subcontracted them to Dr. Shi, the Bat Lady.
Is that the same Dr. Dasick who wrote the letter, in the Lancet that we referred to like way back, seems like forever ago in the podcast? Is
Yes,
that the same guy?
It is. And here are extracts from the grants for fiscal years 2018 and 2019. Now, keep in mind, COV stands for coronavirus, and S protein refers to the virus's spike protein. And I quote, test predictions of COVID interspecies transmission, predictive models of host range emergence potential will be tested experimentally using reverse genetics, pseudovirus, and receptor binding assays, and virus infection experiments across a range of cell cultures from different species and humanized mice. We will use S protein sequence data, infectious clone technology, in vitro and in vivo infection experiments, and analysis of receptor binding to test the hypothesis that divergent thresholds in S protein sequences predict spillover potential.
Right. In non-technical terms, slow it down for me a little bit. Like, what does this mean exactly?
It means the Bat Lady set out to create novel coronaviruses with the highest potential infectivity for human cells. Her plan was to take genes that coded for spike proteins possessing a variety of measured affinities for human cells, ranging from high to low. She would insert these spike genes one by one into the backbone of a number of viral genomes, reverse genetics, and infectious clone technology, creating a series of chimeric viruses. These chimeric viruses would then be tested for their ability to attack human cell cultures in vitro and humanized mice, and this information would help predict the likelihood of spillover, the jump from coronavirus from bats to people with no intermediary host, no civet, no aardvark, no anteater, no pangolin, no nothing, no snake, nothing.
All right, point blank, I gotta know that. Did Dr. Shi generate COVID-19? Point blank.
It cannot be stated conclusively that Dr. Shi, the Bat Lady, did or did not generate COVID-19 in her lab because her records have been sealed by the Communist Chinese. But it seems she was certainly on the right track to have done so. I would now like to quote Richard H. Ebright, a molecular biologist at Rutgers University and a leading expert in biosafety. It is clear that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was systemically constructing novel chimeric coronaviruses and was assessing their ability to infect human cells and human ACE2 expressing mice. It is also clear that depending on the constant genomic context chosen for analysis, this work could have produced COVID-19 or a proximal progenitor of COVID-19. Note, genomic context refers to the particular viral backbone used as the test bed for the spike protein.
I think it's fair to say that, as we are wrapping things up here, that the lab escape scenario for the origin of COVID-19 virus, that specific scenario, as should by now be evident, given what we've discussed, is not mere, hand waving in the direction of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We're not just going to look over there, it could be this. No, it is a detailed proposal based on a specific project being funded by the, what was it again? What was the organization? The
NIAID. Yeah.
Yeah, that one. There's a basis to this. It's not just something that's kind of just being said for the sake of being said.
Which is why the scientific community and certain Western governments all have dirty hands in this, not just Communist China, and would, accountability, they're going to avoid accountability in this regard at all costs, in my opinion. Lots of future grant money here is at stake. Let's be clear on a key motive here, and that's why they're doing the ostrich and the sand maneuver, in my opinion, to a large degree. Yeah,
but despite such a stark conclusion, I hope it's been relatively clear that our preference, throughout this podcast was for a balanced, argument, a balanced discussion, that led to the truth, not for a victory for one side over the other. We're here just presenting evidence that we have found and we're just bring it to the forefront. That's what we're just kind of doing here.
Yes, but the fact is, the world now faces a strong possibility that scientific research intended to avert a pandemic instead started one. That all that collecting of viruses and sampling of bats in remote caves and then hiding the specimens in secret databases had put all of humanity in harm's way.
Yeah.
That 2 decades of research on the genomes of SARS-CoV viruses had not produced a vaccine, but instead an epic plague, COVID-19, and that from the start, there had been an active campaign by Chinese scientists and government officials, aided and abetted by far too many scientists, scientific journal editors, and journalists, mainstream media in the West, to prevent the world from finding out just what the hell happened.
Yeah, I mean, and if another pandemic of, mysterious or ambiguous origin occurs, in the next decade or so, unless we learn from key lessons now from this pandemic, we'll just make the same mistakes. That's just bound to happen.
I mean, so far the world shows little sign yet of either finally shutting down the wildlife trade or addressing the risk of the burgeoning pathogen research worldwide, let alone both. There's little progress, if any, of governments designing a better system to encourage whistleblowing or transparency in science, public health, global pathogen surveillance, better security on gain-of-function research, none of it.
Yeah, or rather the reverse, honest discussions among leaders and scientists, had been threadbare, I think.
Worse than threadbare, they were making fun of anyone who went against them, belittling and humiliating them globally. So, sadly, that's where we are. And you heard it here on Amir Phillips, American Pragmatist. In February 1975, a group of scientists gathered near a beach in California at Asilomar near Monterey. They agreed to establish voluntary guidelines to ensure that recombinant DNA technology would be used safely worldwide. They agreed to draw up safe containment procedures in the laboratory, to limit the experiments to strains of bacteria that were unable to live outside the laboratory, and to avoid working on highly pathogenic organisms. Designed to reassure the public that science was being transparent, the conference set the tone of the debate for decades to come. For almost 50 years thereafter, biotechnology was indeed reassuringly safe, but it has long since abandoned the cautious limits set at Asilomar. As this podcast has documented, pathogenic viruses have indeed been the subject of frequent recombination or engineering experiments, gain of function. As the COVID-19 pandemic ends, a new Asilomar conference is needed, vitally needed, to globally regulate, specifically gain of function. Even if we never discover the origins of COVID-19 exactly, engaging in the process of investigation will have yielded life-saving outcomes if the world adopts new policies and mitigation strategies to prevent outbreaks that result from natural spillovers or laboratory accidents. Actions must be taken to prevent laboratory-based outbreaks and regulate high-risk pathogen research. We desperately need a new international moratorium and biosecurity treaty focused on pathogen research. Otherwise, we are all at risk of another COVID-19 breaking out through a laboratory spillover. We end this podcast with a tribute to those who made this change possible, especially the sleuths of Drastic, who labored away for many months, mostly unrewarded with anything other than ridicule and insult from mainstream media. They dug deeper and crawled through darker holes than any scientist into subterranean ores of data and searched for nuggets of truth about what happened in Wuhan and Yunnan in the years before 2020. People like the Sika, Rosanna Secreto, Francisco de Ribera, Yuri Dagan, Charles Small, Brian Reed, Billy Bosticson, Monali Rahalkar, Gillis Damanouf, Moreno Koliakovo, and Barbel Elephant. Hopefully I didn't butcher the names too bad. I apologize. As well as many others whose contributions will remain nameless. Twitter was their only forum, Had they not persevered in their own time and at their own expense, when all the well-funded forces of science, journalism, business, and politics took little, if any, interest in the origins of COVID-19, we might never have had the chance to find out as much truth as we currently have. And to not dig further is a devastating insult to the millions who lost their lives to the terrible pandemic of COVID-19. We also pay our respects to the whistleblowers in China who first sounded the alarm and hastened the global release of information regarding the novel outbreak in Wuhan. Some of them gave their lives and well-being to do so and are heroes in the truest sense of the word. The impact of their bravery cannot be overstated. How many of us would willingly jeopardize our safety and that of our loved ones to tell the world what truth we did know in this matter? The fate of the investigation into the origin of the pandemic still depends on these courageous souls, these whistleblowers in communist China. There's hope that some of the few people there who hold the pieces of the puzzle within China's borders will one day, even if decades later, be able to illuminate the story of how COVID-19 found its way into Wuhan from Yunnan province. We have seen time and again that the truth often comes out many years later. Hopefully, we will not have to wait that long. You heard it here on Amir Phillips, American Pragmatist.